Welcome to another episode of the WAN Manager Podcast. I am your host, Bryan, as always, and this is the show where we talk to networking experts about the data services that make business possible. So today, our guest is Rob Schult, and he heads the commercial team here at TeleGeography, where they keep tabs on prices for data services all around the world. I'll let him talk more about that. And I have to say, in this episode, I'm going to have to rein myself in topic-wise a bit because, Rob, you and I have worked together for more than a decade and a half. And I have a feeling, well, we talk about this stuff all the time. I have a feeling we could go on way too long for my 45-minute format here, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so welcome, Rob. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about what your history at TeleGeography maybe and what the commercial team at TeleGeography does?
Sure. So I started at TeleGeography, believe it or not, almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
I joined the company when we really started looking at submarine cable infrastructure. We had sort of moved away from voice and realized that data was a big thing. And the question that I presented was, how much does it cost? Being the initial member of the pricing team, as it was then, basically started soliciting quotations, pricing inputs, transaction prices for things like STM1s across the Atlantic. Our pricing service has evolved, of course, as data services have. But that's kind of where it started. Our team has grown to cover everything from wavelength services to IP transit in the wholesale space. Greg, you and I started the enterprise service, looking at IPVPN, DIA, local access, all those components of the WAN that are so important for corporate networks.
Yeah, and it's one of those things like plus ça change. My French is bad, but that as much as everything has grown and the whole market has changed, and there's always new things to cover. Ultimately, you're still asking people how much stuff in an opaque market costs, right?
Absolutely. And I think the thing that's so interesting, and we'll get to this a little bit, is the dependence on geography, dependence on so many of the economic factors in different countries around the world, regulation, it all folds into this. And when corporations sort of plan their global networks, they have to recognize that not every country is the same. And certainly they know that, but they may question why things in the Middle East are so much more expensive than they are in Western Europe, things like that. And there's justification for it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, I think to keep us, within some kind of reasonable time limit and cabinet, since we could talk about so much, I wanted specifically to talk about the sort of connections between the wholesale market and the enterprise market for data services, right? But I already talked to our colleague, Alan Malden, who is, sort of TeleGeography's and the world's expert on submarine cables and how that might impact the enterprise. I thought maybe with you, we would focus in more specifically on IP transit. I've heard that internet is going to be a big thing in the WAN these days, right? So maybe you could help us draw that connection between sort of what counts as internet service in the wholesale telecom space and how that gets broken down into the enterprise or kind of retail space. So Rob, maybe first you could define IP transit for us. Not everyone in the enterprise world interacts with any kind of IP transit. If you're not an ISP or a carrier or whatnot, it may not be something that they're totally familiar with. So how do you define IP transit in our research?
I think in the simplest sense, it's the way that networks access each other, right? So I think our definition, in our frequently asked questions in some of our research, we talk about a form of interconnection whereby the customer network pays to have traffic carried by the transit provider to the transit provider's own network, as well as all of its customers and peers. So that's really important distinction there, right? So you can have relationships with an adjacent network where you only see each other, Or if you're buying IP transit from an upstream provider, not only are you seeing their entire network and all of their connections, but you're seeing their peers, their customers as well. And
Right.
I think that's how the global internet works. And really, what you have globally is a dozen or so big carriers that offer settlement free peering between each other. They don't pay
Right.
each other, but they invest in their networks at a similar scale where it's in their interest to peer with each other and share the network. Everybody else has to pay, right?
Hmm.
So they have to accommodate the investment that's necessary to reach all corners of the world, through all the submarine cable assets and data center assets and those kind of things.
Right, and just to make it clear that that for the most part, enterprises that aren't in, say, content or media or something don't have enough traffic to ever get to either the peering kind of relationships or even sort of to need to purchase IP transit for the most part, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it depends on how sophisticated your network team is, whether, and
Hmm.
we'll get to this a little bit later, whether you have an autonomous system number or not.
Right.
Right. But that seems to be, or that is the distinction. In order to buy IP transit, you need to be able to run BGP and you have to have an autonomous system number that you can declare all your IP addresses through.
Right, right. Okay. And so just to give folks a picture of the kind of transactions that we're talking about in terms of volume, I am currently working on our WAN market sizing report, which comes from our WAN manager survey and our benchmarking customers, where we get a look at what sort of real multinational enterprise networks look like. And to throw some data at everybody, because I love doing that, 70% of DIA ports in enterprise-wide area networks in our data are at the FAST-E, like 100 meg level or below. It's only about 10% that are at the gig-E or higher level. MPLS even skews a little bit less than that. The typical MPLS port size in the world is still, believe it or not, 50 megs. That always sounds weird to us at home, where we have FiOS or Infinity or something, or 300 or 400 megs. But of course, these are dedicated services and that sort of thing. But it's been a long time since I worked on wholesale stuff at TeleGeography. Even back then, things were skewed much higher in the wholesale world. Of course, what's sort of the typical currency of the realm in IP transit in 2021 here?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on geography, right, and the
Well, that is
scale.
in our name, right? So,
Yeah, and the
yeah.
scale of the network players. I think
Hmm.
when you're looking in developed markets like Western Europe, U.S., North America, the big hubs in Asia, you're definitely talking 10 gigabits. In most cases, you're talking 100 gigabit market. In many
Hmm.
cases, they prefer not to sell anything less than a 100 gigabit port for a number of reasons. But for customer management, you don't want to have to keep adding or adjusting the capacity upward if you know that their requirement's going to grow. From a customer standpoint, there's interconnects to be concerned about. So I
Hmm.
think that's really what we're seeing. IP transit is a high volume, low margin game, right? Like people
Right.
talk about it as a
Right.
commodity service. A packet's a packet, right? There's no real differentiation except for like unit costs and reach, right?
Right.
The effect that you can peer with other people. So definitely scaling from the 10 gigabit world to the 100 gigabit world. One thing we're tracking really closely right now is when does the 400 gigabit world come to
Hmm.
reality? We've definitely seen it in some metro environments in Europe where they're introducing it into their own networks to be able to route traffic through the big hubs like Milan and
Right.
Marseille. But as everything scales up, the cost per unit goes down, and that's one
Hmm.
of the reasons why we track that.
And the cost per unit is always going down over time too, right? So there's
Yep.
multiples. Yeah. But when thinking about the sort of physical plumbing of the internet, which it's easy even for folks sitting in a WAN manager kind of role to forget about that tie to the physical infrastructure. If you're talking about something like 400 gig ports, that can only happen once there's already DWDM service between those cities at the 400 gig level in enough volume to be able to support that kind of thing, right? So that's there. We're still one layer of abstraction away from that. Okay, there's fiber in the ground, and then we put different equipment on either end of that fiber, and we get more bits across that same amount of fiber, or we built a new submarine cable or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the other interesting things, and again, it depends a little bit on geography, is this shift away from sort of legacy technologies, right? So, like before, or for many years, we have tracked ports based on TDM or SDH and SONET interconnection,
Right.
and it pretty much anything going forward in any market around the world right now is all Ethernet based. So in particular for IP transit, seldom will you ever be able to buy a port below a gigabit, right? You can buy a commitment on that gigabit port,
right.
but
but the transport between is going to be based on a gig-y handoff or whatever.
Exactly, and even so, like in bigger markets, the service provider doesn't really want to handle gig-y ports anymore. They want 10 gig-y ports and allow you to burst up past that. So
right. Yeah, I remember what it was. Maybe just within the last year or two, seeing a press release that AT&T was finally turning down all of their TDM circuits in the U.S. So the U.S. ILECs that were one of the big holdouts for that kind of thing, right? So,
yeah. I mean, and I'm not sure if we'll talk about this later, but I think the reality is that they're not adding any new SDH and SONET, right? Even the equipment providers are not selling it anymore. But if you have a huge install base, which they do, you're gonna carry it forward as long as you can, until your customer requests or demands that you change them over to a more efficient, lower cost service, right? So I think that's
one of the things that this is kind of a side note from our main topic here, but it's always interesting that often the last places to turn down those older technologies are the most developed markets, because they have the sort of most stickiness in terms of customers. When you're doing mostly greenfield development in markets like, say, parts of Southeast Asia or LATAM or whatever, then they were at Ethernet long before you have, tier 2 markets in the US are the place where you still find lots of DS3s and OC3s and stuff like that, right? So,
right. Yeah. A lot of the driving force behind it is space, right? So, equipment for SDH and SONET is much bigger than Ethernet. It uses more power. It's more expensive to run and harder to manage and get like replacement parts for. So, yeah.
And just the nitty gritty of like engineers to do it, right? You have a team of people who still know legacy technology.
Exactly. It's kind of like COBOL. There's still some people out there that know it, but nobody new was learning it, right? So there's an element of that.
All right, so let's talk pricing a bit. Like I mentioned before, it's been a long time since I worked on wholesale kind of research, but I remember in covering IP transit when we had to switch our sort of chart output and whatnot into the have a decimal point, because there was a distinction between $2 per meg and $1.50 per meg that we needed to make for the first time, right? What kind of prices are we talking about now for some of those key ports sizes that you mentioned in say maybe key IX kind of markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think again the distinction is geography, right? So like in North America, and we usually talk about 10 gig ports, but the conversation obviously is shifting to 100 gig. But sort of in this conversation, we'll stick with 10 because that's universal. I think for 10 gig ports in the US, we're seeing sort of mid-teens to low 20 cents per megabit. And that's pretty standard. In Europe, it's pretty similar. To be honest, and many of the players offering the services are the same, right? In Oceania and Asia is kind of where we see higher prices. In Singapore, you see sort of like a median of about 73 cents a meg. That's pretty exact, but 70-ish cents a meg.
And you've been looking at this recently, I can tell.
I was just checking the stats in the latest big publication. And then in Sydney, it's about 250 a meg. In Mumbai, it's about 475 a meg, 470 a meg.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, any one of those would have been drastically cheap just 5 years ago in Western Europe or the US, right?
Yeah. And really the thing that it has to compensate for is the distances between markets, the
Right.
submarine cable capacity required to provide the interconnection with other networks, all those different things. So, that geographic distance and the technology required to bring it together, that's what
Mm-hmm.
drives the price differences.
Right. So we got a little economic geography there that, Sydney being a very well developed market with a fair degree of competition is still r- really quite extravagantly expensive compared to other markets, mostly because of that kind of bottleneck, because you have to get a long distance submarine cable to get there, basically.
It is absolutely. Now,
Yeah.
and I would say that the other thing, we try to track all the regions, right? We look at all the different continents, but Latin
Mm-hmm.
America has sort of been well, it's a bright spot if you're buying IP transit there. It's not so good if you're
Right.
trying to sell it, but it has been a market where prices have fallen very quickly.
Right.
New submarine cable capacity going from the U.S. down to Sao Paulo, in particular.
Mm-hmm.
With many different providers, with a lot of new capacity. The wavelength prices have dropped precipitously on that route, and thus IP transit has fallen. And we've been looking at sort of 30% CAGRs over the last 3 years for IP transit in that market. But even in Latin America, prices can differ. So Sao Paulo obviously is the cheapest at
Mm-hmm.
sort of 70 cents a meg. But when you look at places like Santiago and Buenos Aires, big markets in their own right, the prices are still a bit more expensive at around sort of $2 ish a meg.
And there again, the answer is probably what mostly that the submarine cables tend to land on the east coast of Brazil, essentially, right, or around
Absolutely.
Sao Paulo or Rio, right? So,
Yeah. And the thing to watch, right, is as new infrastructure gets extended into these other markets, will the prices also fall? And I mean, I think the answer is yes. So
right.
from all our experience, that tends to be the case.
So even in IP transit, that's a plug that it's good for everyone. uh, you know, all the way down to the multinational corporate IT team to pay attention to the map I have behind me of submarine cables. Right, so
Yeah.
that makes a big difference. All right. Well, how about the sort of variation? The most expensive market you mentioned was Mumbai, but what about the sort of maybe considerably less competitive or geographically challenged markets? What are we
Yeah,
talking there?
and again, I was trying to look for some good examples here, and I think the price of IP transit generally reflects the level of connectivity, and to
Hmm.
some degree regulation, right? So, like Mumbai is expensive because the backhaul is expensive. The
Right.
wet capacity to India is not. There's a lot of it, but based on rules and laws and regulation,
I
the
remember the
final
old half circuit rules for Reliance or whatever.
right,
Yeah, it
right,
wasn't
way back.
Reliance. It was, yeah,
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 way back in the
yeah,
day, VSNL, I
yeah,
think, right? We used to
yeah,
look for.
yeah. That's what I'm trying to think of. Yep.
Um, but Africa is a pretty good example, right? So South Africa, there's been a ton of investment on cables going to South Africa. The price
Hmm.
for wavelengths has fallen, and prices for global IP transit in that market is probably in the $2 a meg range. We've definitely heard lately that it's going down even faster based
Hmm.
on some upgrades on some cable systems. But as of Q2, that's kind of the number we were looking at. But in places like Uganda, which is inland, right, inland from where the cable landing
Hmm.
stations are, you're
Hmm.
talking more like $8 a meg. So I
Right.
guess the point being is that not every market's the same,
Hmm.
and you really have to kind of understand what those upstream costs are in order to be
Right.
able to account for it.
And some of that was honestly always a little bit counterintuitive to me, in the sense that for everyone thinking back to when I had this conversation with Alan, or who's familiar with the market in submarine cable, first and foremost, it's about the size of a garden hose, more or less, right? It's fairly small. There are more these days, but there were at most a handful now to up to maybe a dozen fiber pairs. Whereas you build ducts terrestrially, you could put just tons and tons of fiber. But is it that it's the market that makes it that much more expensive? It's not necessarily a physical thing, but it's that you have to trade telecoms every time you cross a border, and however many borders you might have to get to that submarine cable, everybody's taking their sort of piece of that. Is that it?
In many cases, yeah. And sometimes the terrestrial network capacity is a lot more expensive than a much longer segment on the submarine capacity, right?
Right,
So
right. Yeah.
that's
Well, and there's, I guess a lot more opportunities for digging
right.
terrestrially than the few anchor drops that happen in the submarine world and
Yeah.
whatnot. So,
Well, one other thing I did want to mention, just in terms of like developing markets, is like when we look at how internet backbones are oriented and where the big hubs of the world are, right? Like two really good examples are Marseille and Miami, right?
mm-hmm.
Marseille, in many cases, is sort of, for East Africa in particular, it's where all the traffic goes, right? So, what you'll see in that regard are ISPs sort of circumventing the local provider. There's not really an
Right.
IP transit market or center of gravity, if you will, in their own country, and they can provision transport wavelengths to Marseille and purchase
Mm-hmm.
IP transit for 15 cents a meg, whereas locally it would be much more expensive. Miami is very much the same. For many years we've seen sort of prices driven by the IP transit price in Miami plus whatever the transport price was.
Right.
And I think one evolution that we've seen is that as prices for transport declined, people saw opportunities to sell into these new markets, right? The cost of entry wasn't as high. So instead of the local companies in Brazil trying to go to Miami, you see some of the bigger name IP transit providers looking to expand their offering in Sao Paulo. So there's a little bit of
Right.
back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And from a traffic performance, that is helpful as well, right? Because you're not doing the big trombone anymore, right? So,
Absolutely. And the service that you're getting is a lot better as well, right? Because
right.
like if you're buying 110 gig wave to Miami to buy IP transit, you're buying 110 gig wave. If an IP transit provider is offering service in Sao Paulo, they're going to have multiple paths, probably at 100 gig waves running at high overhead, right? So, the networks really only run at about 50 to 60% capacity to
Right.
account for bursts and things like that. So the service that you'll ultimately get is going to be a lot better.
Yeah, so mentioning that sort of trombone traffic from Sao Paulo and whatnot, it just kind of, I know this may be a little far afield from the way that we collect these data at TeleGeography, but maybe you can speak a little bit to the difference, maybe in any amount of price discrimination that IP transit providers can engage in based on that traffic profile difference. So what I mean is, like, if you're, say, a small ISP in Brazil, and mostly what you have are eyeballs in Brazil that are consuming content in Portuguese that maybe largely comes from Brazil. That's very different than if you're a CDN or Netflix or something like that that's pulling most of their content from, say, Miami, right? Are IP transit providers willing and able to sort of discriminate in pricing on the traffic profiles of the folks buying transit?
Well, as far as discriminating, I mean, yes, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times people will give kind of a bespoke price based on your traffic requirements. But I
Right.
think the more common consideration, right, from the standpoint of an ISP is, if I buy IP transit from this provider, will I be able to access all the local eyeballs locally? Are they peered with all the
Right.
ISPs? Are they peered
Mm-hmm.
with all the providers in my market? So my traffic isn't going up to Miami and back, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
really the consideration. So in many markets, whether it be in Asia or in Brazil, for instance, there are providers that their center of gravity would you'd say would be in the U.S., right? So
Right.
they're not going to have that fully peered network locally. And then so what happens is exactly that. They can come in, they can be really inexpensive, but you kind of have to know what you're buying. So I think
Mm-hmm.
from an IP transit perspective, that's certainly a consideration. And when we get to DIA, knowing your
Right.
or even broadband, knowing your broadband provider is just as important, right? Knowing how they're
Mm-hmm.
connected, knowing the services that they give, knowing how their price point compares to the cost of international transit, and we'll
Right.
dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely want to obviously get to sort of the impact on the WAN, but the last thing while we're still kind of talking wholesale is, you mentioned, for example, 30% CAGR annual declines over the past few years in South America, Brazil specifically. Um, and that was an example of it being relatively high. Okay, you have 2 decades of looking at this. What's the sort of typical price decline expectation that folks would have, knowing that it does vary based on these factors like new submarine cables and whatnot?
Sure. So, I mean, I think in IP transit, again, the thing that we're looking at is the unit cost per megabit, right? Or the average unit cost per megabit. And, really what that reflects, and the changes in that reflect are improvements in technology,
Right.
as well as volumes of supply, right? So I think what we estimate, and it has held true for as long as I've been doing this, is that you can anticipate sort of 20% price erosion year on year for IP transit. It can be lumpy a little bit, right? Some years it's a little less, some years it's a little more. But for instance, when you go from 100 gig wavelengths to 400 gig wavelengths, right, the cost to go up, it might start at 4x, but it will come down to like 2.5x at some point,
right.
And I think that's really what you see, sort of the economies of scale really play in
right.
to driving down unit costs and enabling this price erosion. So yeah, all our models, and we've been doing it for a while, kind of have a baseline assumption of about 20%, in most markets. And again, we have to tweak it again based on supply coming new, but or new entrants. But that's kind of what we see, I would say.
Well, and it's funny on that note. Aside from the sort of Econ 101 understanding of telecom is always a little bit interesting in that respect. But I recall many years ago talking to people in the IP transit world who were like, I just can't sustain business at these price points. Now, these are when price points were astronomically higher than they are now, right?
Sure.
It's been some consolidation, but for the most part, they stay in business. And I have to assume that what you see is that demand continually outstrips that cascading price, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're talking 20% price erosion, we're talking at least 25% capacity growth. So there's lots of new requirements for new submarine cable systems. I mean, the install or the base transport requirement, say across the Atlantic, is so huge now, like adding 25% in the next year requires like a new submarine cable system, right?
Right.
So, and
right.
that's really advancing as well, right? So before we used to see 4, 8 fiber pair cable systems going across the ocean. Now you're talking 12 to be standard, 24 coming in the future. So, it's the same sort of construction cost, but it's, averaged over many more different fiber pairs that are operating at much higher transport technologies. Right. So yeah, in the future, all that's going to kick in and allow us to continue to watch all the things we watch and communicate with all the people we want to communicate with.
Yeah, I think that's where my mind goes on this, which is that you might have thought, okay, well, once we make that transition to sort of internet delivery of entertainment and whatnot, there's that big bump up in demand for that. But once that's done, but then you had COVID come along, and everyone stops using their handset on their desk and starts using Zoom and Meet and whatnot. So it seems like there's always something that comes along that is bandwidth hungry that people are going to want access to. So I suppose that may end someday. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, just look at what you get from your television. The regular TV is probably good enough, but now we get a 4D high definition,
4K OLED or whatever it's called.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they charge you more for it too, right?
Right.
Do you really realize the difference in service? I don't know. I haven't tried yet, honestly, but
I have bad vision, so
exactly. With the glasses, does it really matter? But improvements like that in service delivery, I think, will consume ever more bandwidth, right? So.
All right. Well, this is the WAN Manager podcast. Let's wow. I think most people can probably sort of make some of these connections of why I talk about wholesale pricing and markets. But let's get more directly into what is the impact for the IT infrastructure team at a non-telecom internet-oriented company. Most of them, like we said, are not buying IP transit directly or peering or anything like that. Certainly there's some out there. But yeah, the internet though is increasingly sort of a primary, at least secondary method of site connectivity in the enterprise WAN. So why does this matter to the enterprise, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the traffic has to go over the backbone networks, to reach the content and come back, right?
Hmm.
But I
Hmm.
think again, in sort of the context of the enterprise network, is how is your traffic getting there? Is it competing with other people's traffic to get there? Are they sharing infrastructure with other customers?
Hmm.
And affecting maybe performance. So depending on applications, I think enterprises get really sophisticated in sort of the latency and jitter requirements of specific applications, right? So they have to ensure that their network service can sustain that or
Right.
allow for it.
Well, so then maybe the sort of follow up question to that is should enterprises think about getting involved in the wholesale kind of, because certainly there's enterprises buying DWDM wavelengths now increasingly between their data centers or whatever, or are there some hurdles there maybe that make it unlikely for enterprises to jump into that market?
Yeah, I think just the engineering capability is a big hurdle.
Hmm.
Like you have to be
Hmm.
really committed to it to be able to run your own autonomous system. I think
Right.
there's some
Right.
advantages, but obviously you and I talk to lots of multinationals that would rather pass that on to the service
Hmm.
providers, right? You don't have to deal with big network outages and things like that if somebody or does a wrong configuration in a routing table, right? You don't want to have to deal with any of that. You want
Right.
to pay somebody to do that for you. So I think it's probably the big difference.
Actually, in an upcoming episode, I'm going to talk to Michael Martin and McKinsey about just the challenges in upskilling people for the smart networks in, whether that's SD-WAN or incorporating intelligence in a SASE, stuff like that. The last thing you also need to do is get maybe sort of telecom engineers to be at every multinational as well, right on top of all the other skill shortages they have, I suppose. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So that being the case, there is still this direct relationship, right, between your wholesale IP backbone market and the cost of the services that the enterprise consumes, DIA, even business broadband, which is essentially glorified consumer broadband with a few extra guarantees, right? Is that kind of like a one-to-one relationship? So when you mention something, for example, like Sao Paulo prices being under 30% annual pressure, does that mean DIA prices in Sao Paulo are going to be under similar pressure?
We haven't seen it yet. I actually spent some
Hmm.
time looking at it. I think there's a bit of a
Yeah.
lag, right? But
Hmm.
ultimately, DIA will. I think
Right.
and 30% might be extreme based on who's serving those markets. But I think
Hmm.
the idea is that in terms of the service itself, when you're buying DIA, you're buying an uncontended synchronous connection to your upstream provider or to your internet provider,
Right.
right? And the idea is that a packet entering the service provider network is the same as all the other packets that they're carrying.
Hmm.
Broadband is a little different, right? So, I mean, I think the ultimately IP transit is the cost of global interconnection that the ISP is paying. Um,
Right.
but there's a big variance, right, in terms of it being one-to-one for their customers. I think everybody agrees that no matter what you're purchasing from a broadband provider, there is some contention. Like the contention
Hmm.
ratios for
Hmm.
business broadband might be much less than, say, a consumer
Right.
network, but there is still some sharing, and you're not going to get,
Hmm.
if you have a 100 meg connection, you're not going to get 100 meg internationally necessarily. So I think that's really the thing to watch out for.
Well, it would be weird if that were the case, because it's still a fact from everything that I see when I do this kind of analysis that, for the most part, DIA is often 10x the price of broadband, right? So
Sure.
that's what you're paying for is,
Yeah.
uncontended service and carrier grade SLAs and all that sort of thing, right? But yeah, it's my observation in on that front is that in when I look at like we like to make these like chloropleth maps of prices around the world. When you look at the map of say IP transit and DIA, they're not that different in terms of the geographic spreads. Whereas it seems to me that broadband is a little bit flatter across the world in price. I think for this reason that you're saying, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that broadband really has to reflect the local market and the local
Right.
market's ability to pay, right? So the package or the stated capacity, download capacity might be one thing. The price might be really
Right.
inexpensive, yet the service may not be exactly the
hmm
same, right? So,
Yeah.
so I think that that's sort of where it slides a little bit and
hmm
can differentiate between services in different countries.
Yeah, which is a great point. That sort of when you're in the DIA market, that market is really designed for the multinational enterprise who has a certain expectation of what these kinds of data services should cost, as well as how they should perform. Whereas if you're, because we do talk to a lot of IT infrastructure WAN managers who are thinking about shifting a lot of their WAN traffic to the internet, and there's definitely sort of an element of caution there in terms of you know broadband that is designed for the consumer's ability to pay in a developing economy is really probably very unlikely to be the performance level that is necessary for business.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah, interesting. Yeah. All right. So let's talk more about DIA and broadband, I guess. Then in terms of just the spread and what's kind of available out there. So one question we get asked is along the lines exactly of what I was just saying, that of okay, broadband is so much cheaper. I can accept that the performance is maybe a little bit not completely on par with DIA or especially MPLS because I can get so much bandwidth, right? So if I can get a giggy broadband connection that is the same price as say 20 megs of MPLS or DIA, how do you see that working out in terms of performance and price?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is funny. Like the broadband networks have improved so much, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
capacities that they're offering are so much higher than they ever have been.
Right.
For a lot of end users, that difference, if you pay for a gigi and you only get 850 meg, you're probably not
Right.
gonna, notice. And just, I mean, still thinking about some of the benchmark work that we do, right? And how many T1s and DS3s and stuff like,
Yeah.
2 megs are
They're
out
still
there,
out there.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a tremendous number of those. So, yeah, I mean, I think broadband really does offer, a inexpensive, but an offering that allows you to achieve higher capacities.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's for like direct internet offload, right? Like
Right.
that's kind of the service that it's providing, allowing you to get onto the internet. Now, if you have private traffic, it's probably not the best way to do it necessarily.
Sure. Right. Well, and that gets us into topics that we've covered a lot on this show of software defined networking and whatnot.
Yeah,
Right. But
absolutely.
but yeah, but I like that's where I wanted to go with it in this conversation is in terms of thinking through that sort of balance again. If I'm considering having a hybrid network and adding in a lot of internet, that there's a place where I would caution people, like again, we have geography in our name, but it's very key here, which is that yeah, definitely. If you can get gigi for a sort of the price of a much smaller MPLS or DIA port in the US or Western Europe or parts of Southeast Asia or whatever, that's probably a sensible thing. If you're looking at some markets, that low cost is for a service that's maybe very, very different than what you're used to. Whereas MPLS and DIA as a carrier grade service from a sort of global or regional sort of provider have in mind multinational corporations as the customers and international traffic profiles and whatnot. Whereas I do think folks should be cautious about the sort of heroic price savings of broadband sometimes in some markets where their traffic's just going to get handed, right off, and isn't really a network designed for business, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, one of the things you had asked about earlier was sort of a mismatch between broadband and IP transit prices. And,
Right.
and I think
Hmm.
that is a really good metric to examine as part of your evaluation of whether broadband is suitable, right? So,
Right.
I tried to come up with a couple different
That's a good point.
examples,
Yeah.
with
Hmm.
a couple examples actually for you. But, when your broadband price is cheaper than your IP transit price, right?
That's a bad sign.
That's probably a bad sign, right? So
Yeah.
not 100% of your traffic that you're generating could be international, right?
Right. Right.
So that a couple examples in the U.S. I was we track business broadband packages. Try
Hmm.
to do it in every country around the world and see what's available in terms of broadband services for enterprises. And in the US, Verizon Fios is really well known. They have a 100 megabit service up and down for like $70 a month, right? So
Hmm.
that's 70 cents per meg, more or less.
Right.
And then the
Yeah.
IP transit price is, say, 18 cents a meg or 15 cents a
Right.
meg.
So there's a nice healthy gap there, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So, but in markets like India, right, this was a good example. Broadband in India is really inexpensive, and it does
Hmm.
accommodate the local market. So there you have or business broadband, a plan for like 100 meg at $50 a month. So 50 cents a meg, but the global
Hmm.
IP transit price is closer to $5 a meg. It's about 460 a meg, right?
Right.
So there's a
Yeah.
big difference, and,
Yeah.
and and that's a thing. Now there are some other odd things in India, right? So I mean,
Hmm.
those are local ISPs, but then you have new market entrants that totally disrupt everything.
Right.
Reliance Geo came in, and they started offering mobile broadband services, 150 bucks a meg for free, right? So
Hmm.
I guess
Right.
that's one way to
Right.
get customers. That's more a consumer
Yeah.
play than an enterprise play,
Right.
but those kind of disruptions can happen.
Yeah, no, I always remember India being a strange market in that sense, and when you in the sense of that local data is really really cheap and international is really expensive.
Right.
So I mean, just like thinking through submarine cable routes, like Marseille to Mumbai is way more expensive than Marseille to Singapore, right?
Right.
And so and then squaring that circle with it being one of the cheapest ISP markets in the world, obviously you're suffering in terms of traffic profiles and quality and stuff like that, right? I mean,
Right.
there's no way you can make that work,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. No, and that's it's an odd market as well, like with local access, right? Like we've done a
mhm,
lot of
right.
examinations of local access costs in India, and it's really inexpensive compared to even say Western Europe or the US.
Right.
So yeah, it's
Probably in for the same reason. There's local companies, they throw up a telephone pole, or and there again, if you have things on poles rather than in trenches, then it's, I mean, perhaps more dangerous, more likely to be stripped of whatever valuable metals are on it and that sort of thing, right?
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that gives us a really good picture of kind of how those markets relate, why the sort of non telecom company might still want to pay attention to IP transit, especially that last point of that, like understanding that if you know what IP transit is in that market, you can tell sort of what you're really getting from an ISP. Any other thoughts that you have to sort of close us out on why the sourcing team at a multinational should pay attention to the wholesale market, or what aspects of the wholesale market they should pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost infrastructure, right? So where are
Hmm.
new cables being built? Where are new competitors entering the marketplace?
Right.
I think that in Africa, for instance, there's a tremendous amount of new investment coming online in the next couple of years. Connecting countries that have never been connected before, right?
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
think that's one to watch. Brazil was the perfect example of that, right?
Right.
And Johannesburg to a degree, but if you look at Miami to Brazil or Marseille to Johannesburg, the prices fell a lot because of new capacity, because of cable upgrades,
Right.
and that really drives everything. I mean, you need wavelengths to power IP transit. backbones. You need wavelengths to connect MPLS routers, right?
Mm-hmm.
For IPVPN services, all those things, the wavelength is the underlying cost element.
And sorry to interrupt, but it brings me back to sort of 20 years ago in graduate school for geography, of that the connections between the connections around the world, and we see this on our maps over there, tend to be east-west, not north-south, right? And so when you have those points like Johannesburg and Sao Paulo are perfect examples, that it took some time to get the north-south built into the east-west networks, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't mean that in the telecom OSS BSS sense, right? So, yeah.
Right, your Sonata API, right?
Yeah.
No, so and then the other thing I think to really watch out for is how does your requirement compare to the next higher capacity increment, right? Like I think one of the things that has held true in all the scenario evaluations that we've done in WAN cost benchmarks is like, how do I go from 10 meg to 100 meg? How much more is that going to cost? If I go to a gig E, how much more is that going to cost? Well,
Right.
you have to recognize that as these networks scale, the unit costs go down, so those higher prices come down faster. And the other thing, and this is a little bit more aligned to transport, but like Ethernet transport, if you're looking in Ethernet transport, between sites in data centers, don't buy a gigi. The differential price between a gigi and a 10 gigi is minimal. And some carriers are trying not to even offer 10 gigi, or not to offer gigi anymore, because they need to deliver it. They have to have additional equipment to break it out. So they'd prefer just to give you a gigi and let you go with it. So I think those
a 10 gig,
a 10 gig, and just go with it. And then that transition, like we mentioned a little bit before, from legacy technologies to newer technologies. If you have those legacy technologies in your network, there's cost savings to be had, right? Take advantage of that, and suffer through the transition, because then you'll be in a place where you can take advantage going forward.
I mean, that argument's kind of old at this point, but it's like the Ethernet handoff should be easier at the office anyway. So really get rid of the TDM, SONET, SDH stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but I think just that general awareness of infrastructure, of new investment. I think one thing that we track as well, sort of in the cloud world, are where are the cloud providers going? The big content guys, as they expand into your local market. That's a pretty good indication that prices for international services will come down, just because they bring that scale. They're the ones that are investing in new cable systems of 12 and 24 fiber pairs, right? And lowering the unit costs pretty much for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. All right. Well, Rob, this was really interesting. Thank you so much. I can't believe it took me this long to get you on the podcast. But
well, it was a pleasure. It's always great.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Thanks.
All right. Look forward to hearing all the others. Bye.
Thanks very much for listening. The WAN Manager podcast is brought to you by TeleGeography, a division of Primetrica Incorporated, and is edited and produced by Jane Miller. I wrote the theme song you're listening to right now, and we get administrative canine support from my dog Honeybun, who you might hear chiming in from time to time when the mood strikes her. If you want to learn more about our data, head over to telegeography.com, where you can find our blog that covers many of the topics we hit here, and you can sign up for our WAN Manager newsletter. Until next time, have a great day.